Afternoon, folks. Happy Friday. So I'm Jim. I work at Wonkhe, which is a sort of higher education blog, think tank thing. Do have a look if you've not come across us. It's fairly self-explanatory when you hang around on the site. This is a bit of a cheat of a session, so I'm going to do two things really in this session. First of all, we're really interested in a couple of things in terms of quality. So we're really interested in a thriving and successful debate about higher education that involves students, student media, partly because that's a good feature of a democratic society and so on, partly because in our kind of DNA as an organisation, we're trying to get the debate about the future of higher education out of the oak-panelled rooms of London and into the hands of academics and professional services staff and students. So student media has a really important role to play. Conscious that a lot of student union staff and a lot of student union officers really want there to be successful student media that generates interesting stories and has fantastic volunteering opportunities for students, and sets them up for careers generally in journalism, or very specifically in specialist journalism. So we're interested in all of that, but crucially the other thing we're interested in is good reporting about higher education. So one of the things that everyone in Team Wonkhe does every morning is read everything that is published in the UK, as long as it's been published online and we have a subscription. Everything that's been written about students, higher education, graduates, and universities. And there's a lot of really good reporting out there, a lot of absolute dross, a hell of a lot of one major national news outlet copying another major national news outlet without going to the original source. But lots of really interesting content. And one of the things that we do is that we try to, although lots of you change your websites very often, those of you that are involved in certainly in student newspapers or magazines, can't listen to all the radio stations, I'm afraid, but certainly those of you that publish the written word, we try to read all of your stuff too, although we don't highlight that and carry that for our subscribers. And our general view is that the reporting about universities isn't as good as it could be, and that lots of student journalists and student media outlets are missing obvious stories. And that also there could probably be, so I guess, lots of student journalists will get lots of support around making sure they don't print something that's unlawful. Presumably that's what happened in the hour that we've just had. I think that's what everyone was doing in the 1 till 2 slot. But also, we take the view that we might be able to assist with helping student journalists find data sources and ways in which they can interpret what's going on inside higher education, partly because we see a lot of stories about what a particular student officer in a student union has said on Twitter, probably less stuff that's about holding universities to account in terms of their promises, their performance, and so on. And so, if there are ways in which, we can help that, democratic debate on campus, democratic in nature, if not specifically in terms of, meetings and votes, then we really want to help contribute to that. So I'm going to talk about some bits of that and some stories that we think people miss based on some data sources. I'll try and do that at relative speed, and then I'm very, very happy to kind of hang around for the other half an hour of this session and really help answer questions that people might have about national universities policy, what September is going to look like, the interaction between lockdowns and universities and so on. So, if people have got questions about how on earth all of this is going to work, the finances of universities, anything, very happy to hang around and see if I can answer as many questions as possible while we're on the call. And that might take us to 3, it might take us to 2:30, who knows, it's Friday. Now, let's crack on. Largely, what I'm going to rattle through in terms of these 10 things are a bunch of data sources that we hardly ever see manifest themselves in reporting amongst student media. And we think that's a shame. So one of the things that we have noticed is the reporting that is there on student media about universities it is often a sort of remix of what a university itself has announced, or a particular scandal that's happened on campus, or a sort of local version of a national story that will have been in the Mail or the Telegraph or whatever. But what that methodology does, if that's your methodology for reporting on the university, is miss a bunch of stories. And I just want to give you a sense of a bunch of data sources where there are potentially some stories, you know, on a quiet week, and potentially some interesting stories on a busy week too. So just to go through them, and what I'll do is I'll send to Rosie, so that we can, you know, distribute them, a bunch of links to all of these sorts of sources so that you can spot them. First here is LEO, longitudinal educational outcomes data. What lots of people I think don't know is that we now have a really quite interesting data set that allows us to look at the future salary, well, not the future, the past salary performance of particular subjects on campus at particular universities. And you can interrogate that, and you can do what we've certainly seen the tab do a few times, which is remix parts of that data in order to give readers a sense of what high earning subjects are at your university, lower earning subjects are at your university, and so on. Now, there's 2 aspects to that. One is that's just quite interesting for lots of students, many of whom in particular, as we go into what's likely to be a global recession, are worried about the graduate recruitment market. But very specifically, what that assists in doing potentially is ensuring that universities are doing all they can to help students in what is going to be a really tough employment market in the next few years. Certainly students' unions, and we spend a lot of time with students' unions, spend a lot of time lobbying universities to make sure their career services are up to scratch and that appropriate employability content is in the curriculum. But, you know, pressure from student media to say, look, you know, we really do need to make sure that the university is doing all it can to help students, particularly in, you know, particular subject areas or particular, you know, parts of a university's demographic that aren't performing well on LEO data. That would be very interesting to see. And as I say, we don't see a lot of that generally in student media reporting. Related to that, which lots of people don't know about, is something called graduate outcomes. Until very recently, there was a survey that would be carried out by each university where about 6 months after you graduated, someone from the university would phone you up and find out what you were doing, whether you were in a graduate job, how much you earned, and so on. And that process has now been replaced by centralized data collection with a project called Graduate Outcomes. And Graduate Outcomes phones people 18 months afterwards and then at other points, and looks at a variety of things. And we now have the initial data set for this that you will be able to interrogate to look at some of these things from, you know, from the point of view of your institution. So we have things like what graduates at your university have gone on to do, how much they're earning, their reflection on their activities. That's very interesting because that includes things like whether students got out of their course what they wanted to get out of their course, whether it met their objectives, whether they would have chosen to do a different course if they had their time again. Very interesting stuff. And then some other bits and bobs in terms of intel. So again, a really interesting story generally, yeah, but also a really important story, as I say, as we enter what is likely to be a really tough time for young people generally and graduates specifically in entering the labour market. And obviously, you know, really important that universities do all they can to ensure that students are able to, you know, if not seek actual work, you know, at least to find other opportunities and so on. So that's graduate outcomes. And again, you know, I'll put the links where you can find some of these data sets and how you can interrogate them into Rosie for distribution later. Third one I'm going to talk about is access and participation. Now, look, the classic kind of human interest story, I guess, would be where there are some stark figures, and what good student media does is bring that to life with humans, I guess. No one wants to just look at figures, except probably those of us at Wonkhe. What readers want to do is they want to see figures and then see that illustrated through stories and tales. And one of the things I'd say is we do read quite a bit of kind of stories and tales stuff, human interest stuff, but quite often it's not underpinned by very good figures. And, you know, certainly on access and participation, there are easy ways to find some of those figures. So what we're getting at here is the gaps between students with different characteristics at 4 different stages of the student life cycle. So if you look on the top there, access, continuation, that's whether or not people drop out. Attainment, that's whether or not people get a 2-1 or a first. And progression, what they go on to do, whether they go on to get a job or whatever that might be. And one of the things that you can do really, really quickly, thanks to the Office for Students, which is the English regulator, other data sources are available for those of you in around the nations, and I'm very happy to point those out, is that you very quickly can interrogate this dashboard to look at what the gaps are like at your institution, which, as I say, either is a story that you can then illustrate with humans, or is a human story that you can, that you can fill with and, justify with some of these numbers. In particular, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this data set is, for example, on ethnicity, really important issue over the past few weeks, Black Lives Matter and so on. On ethnicity, we do get a breakdown that separates out the different bits of BAME. So we get Black students, Asian students and so on, rather than just BAME all lumped together, which, are the sorts of numbers that are often quoted. So you can see really interesting gaps here, as I say, on all 4 stages of the life cycle. That data is there. We hardly ever see that data reported, as I say, by student media, but very powerful when it does get reported. The 4th is university accounts. Now, let me just let you into a brief secret. Reading the financial statements of your university is going to be a fairly dull thing to do, to spend your day doing. But there are almost always really interesting stories in university accounts. Sometimes there are really good stories, positive stories about the impact that the university is having on parts of the community that you might not have taken into account, particular statistics that the university would want to champion that you haven't really thought about, and so on. And if nothing else, if you're new in one of your roles in student media, or indeed if you are someone that supports student media in a role, as I say, as well as that thing about what you're legally allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, a really good source of kind of, pull the curtain back background on how universities work, how they're financed and so on, is a set of university accounts. And what I will put up is 2 things: a guide to how to interrogate university accounts, beyond the kind of glossy bits, and then also, where you can normally kind of find your university accounts and so on. The other thing about university accounts is they're full of stories. So there's always a section on risk, for example, that tells its own set of stories. You can find how much the Vice-Chancellor is paid and how much all the other senior people at the university are paid. You can look at the financial performance of the university over the past few years, something that's going to be really important in the next couple of years. Find out where the fees go, kind of. Find out how much debt the university's in. Find out how it's servicing its capital expenditure, how much it's having to spend on, interest on debt and so on and so on. So looking at, there are always some stories in university accounts. They come out every November. Probably 4 or 5 student media outlets in the country pick that up and run with it. Most probably don't spot it. And, it's arguably a missed opportunity, because in the end, the bulk of the income in most universities is student tuition fee income. And all the research says that students are really keen to know where the money goes and want a sense of accountability about where the money goes. So, you can have some fun with that. This time of year is the time of year when something called the National Student Survey gets published. This is an annual survey of all final year undergraduates around the UK. And there are 27 questions that ask all sorts of things about assessment and feedback and teaching quality and so on and so on. it comes at a funny time of year, so roughly this time of year, next week after normally. We are going to get some results this year. We're expecting OFS to say that it's going to publish this year's results, even though the data was collected just as we went into lockdown in some cases, which is going to be quite controversial. What's really interesting about National Student Survey data at an institutional level are two things. One, dissatisfaction as well as satisfaction. So what are students really unhappy about? Because quite often that doesn't make the news. And in different universities, if you interrogate the data properly, you can find interesting stories about what the student body at your institution really thinks from a dissatisfaction point of view rather than just a satisfaction point of view. And also, what the stats on the OFS website offer you is you can play with time series, so you can see if some things have got better or worse over time. And certainly, for example, there are, tales you can tell here that again relate to humans. So, for example, one of the questions on the National Student Survey asks students whether students feel that they are part of a community of staff and students. Now, clearly, if only 10% of students feel part of a community of staff and students, you might reasonably believe that that might have a significant knock-on effect in terms of students' mental health. And not only would that be a really good hypothesis, we've also managed to prove it with some separate research that we've done at Wonkhe last year on the links between student mental health, social activity, community, and so on. Clearly, all of that comes into sharp focus in terms of the kinds of social activity that people will be able to offer in September. But just away from the pandemic for a minute, there's lots of stories inside the National Student Survey. As I say, if you interrogate a couple of things, the different questions rather than just the headline satisfaction numbers, the time series, what's happened over 3 or 4 years, and also dissatisfaction rather than just raw satisfaction. And again, I'll send to Rosie the links to where you can find all the data and interrogate it and play with it and so on. Now, there are some other data sets that are really interesting. So here's one. So the Higher Education Statistics Agency, fascinating organisation that many of you may not have come across, called HESA, publishes a bunch of aggregated numbers on the finances of universities. And these are really handy because, again, students want to know where the money goes. And it's sometimes really interesting, I think, for readers to find out where the money goes. And we know from research that students want their tuition fee money spent on some things rather than others, and so on and so on. There's lots of detail in the HESA finances figures. One of the things you can find out, for example, is how much profit a university makes out of residencies, catering, and conferencing. So that's halls, bacon baps, and so on. That's quite an interesting number to know, yeah? So I think, lots of students are really interested in, for example, I don't know, how much the halls of residence rent is each year, but there are a hell of a lot of students who will want to know whether the university is making profit out of the photocopiers. And those sorts of things you can find out through HESA finances. And where you can't, it gives you a line of inquiry to then go and ask more detailed questions of the university. So not only will I point out where the links are to some of that data, my colleague DK in the office also quite often does Tableau visualizations of the data that allows you to get at comparisons on some of the lines in this data between your university and other universities. So, particularly if, for example, you are at a university where there's another university in your city, or you're at a university where people often compare you to another 4 or 5 universities around the country, you can have some fun benchmarking and playing with different aspects of the HESA finances data. And again, this is an old trick of the tabs. So probably every 10 days or so, we will see the tab nationally pull something out from HESA data in order to make a table out of it, often in a not very sophisticated way. And of course, you will be able to do some really interesting things, again, that manage to fuse the data with some of the human aspects in terms of the student experience that you're often very close to on campus. Right, 4 more, and then I'll shut up. One is minutes. Now, buried on your university's website somewhere will be the minutes of and papers for really dull sounding university committees. And right now, it's the time of year where new elected student officers, people are suggesting to them that they read previous minutes from many of these bodies, and many of them will. Lots of it is, really interesting. Many of those student officers have got to represent students on those committees, and it's those committees that make the big decisions, right? What stays, what goes, the way in which the university will handle the COVID crisis, the financial difficulties that sector's moving into this September, and so on and so on. What I'd say for those of you involved in student media and student journalism is what minutes often do is provide a rich source of promises that a university has made to do X, Y, and Z that it either has delivered on or it hasn't delivered on by the time you read them. And a really good investigative journalist thing to do, a lot of focus on production and writing and so on, but a really good investigative journalist thing to do is to spot the promises that have been made, to see whether or not they've then been acted on and delivered on. And it probably won't take you long in most universities to find, a set of minutes from 2 years ago or 18 months ago where someone has said, we'll fix X, we'll decorate Y, we'll deal with Z, we'll have new bike racks over there, we'll improve the student experience score on X, whatever it might be. And then, that's a story where you can put some pressure on around making sure that thing is done or fixed or handled or whatever it might be. So, you can have some fun, believe it or not, by burying yourself in the minutes of university committees on your university's website. A few other bits. Believe it or not, the Student Loans Company produces every year stats at provider level, so this is university level, on how many people have taken out a loan and what sort of loan. It comes as a real surprise to people, that around 1 in 10 home students don't take out tuition fee loans, they pay up front. And that is different from provider to provider, right? There are some universities where that's up to 20%, others where it's significantly lower. And there's loads of other angles to that in terms of stories that you can probably generate off the back of, believe it or not, something sounds really dry, student loans company statistics. So again, I'll send to Rosie where you can get hold of that provider level data with the SLC. You can also see how much people have paid back, the amount of total debt that's still outstanding, student debt in the country, and so on and so on. Really, really interesting data set. And of course, again, that's a data set where there's a good potential fusion between a fairly dry set of stats, which is, who's taken out a student loan at this university, and the real plight that students find themselves in terms of student finances, commercial debt, being able to pay the rent, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Number 9 is complaints. So buried on there's a complaints regulator in the UK, an adjudicator technically, called the Office of the Independent Adjudicator. And this is a national service where students go if they have exhausted trying to make a complaint in their local university, and have and don't yet want to go to court, right? So it's an alternative to going to court. Really interesting organisation. And one of the things that they do every year is they produce annual statements for every university about the complaints that have reached it in terms of how many there are and whether that's more than the average and less than the average and so on. Hardly ever see any reporting around that. Interesting little data set, worth having a look. And generally, of course, the number of complaints that students are submitting on campus, what they're submitting them about and so on will probably be of interest to some people. And you are able to find that out if you ask the right questions on campus locally. And then finally, I guess the other one that, we read a lot about are stories around student conduct. And this is everything from, sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, incidents of racial harassment, initiation ceremonies, drunken disorderly behaviour. And doubtless one of the things that the sector is sleepwalking into in terms of September is lots of potential stories about conduct around the issue of COVID-19. So, over the past 2 weeks, there have been lots of stories from North America about student conduct and the way in which students may or may not be observing social distancing rules, those sorts of things. The reason I've put this image of a kind of void up, unlike lots of that other stuff I've talked about, there aren't any national standards around the collection of statistics inside an institution about conduct. And what that it means is, what we can't do nationally is look at conduct, how the number of students that have been disciplined for a thing or fined for a thing and so on. However, most of that is eminently accessible via freedom of information, and you probably will be able to find out, what students are being, done for, if you like, in terms of conduct, what the culture of conduct complaints is on campus and so on. And again, this is a really interesting agenda, because for 10, 15 years now, student officers inside students' unions have been campaigning for better procedures, which better, handle allegations of misconduct, particularly between students or from academics to students. And student media over the years at various institutions has played a really, really important role in highlighting the individual cases, but then sometimes the statistical analysis of what's going on in this conduct space on campus. So again, although there isn't, as I say, a national data source, there is quite a bit of survey data that gets done sometimes around universities around the country. And there are often, as I say, local angles, either off individual bits of casework where you probably do need to make sure you've listened to what happened in the previous hour on the legal advice. But more broadly, getting a sense from students about the culture on campus, whether they feel they can complain and so on, is something that lots of student media has played a really important role in over the past, as I say, 10, 15 years. And that, Rosie, is that. So that's my whistle-stop tour of 10 really easy stories that you can go and find today. Very happy to answer questions, and very happy to answer questions more generally about where the higher education sector is at, what's happening in relation to COVID-19, reopening of campuses and so on and so on.
Wow. Amazingly, we haven't had any Q&A in yet, so I don't know whether you've just blown everybody away with all these different places they can go. I have one for you. So say I'm a really strapped for time student journalist. Where in the next few weeks would you go for your best story to start with for the next few weeks? Where's going to be some really juicy stuff from all you just talked through?
Look, the number one debate right now is the nature, pace and character of the reopening of the UK's higher education campuses. And what's very interesting about it is there are lots of stories that are not dissimilar that will give us a sense of, what people's appetite is. So, for example, I confidently predict at this point that on Sunday, this coming Sunday, there will be a lot of clicks on lots of media outlets, both locally and nationally, on, the conduct of people during Super Saturday. Yeah. Now, if you think about what Freshers Week normally, in theory, is supposed to consist of, in theory, there'll be lots of interest in what young people are doing. I've seen certainly in the press over the past few weeks, this stuff about some students attending raves. Big story in Leicester just before that big lockdown hit around a big block party that happened on a street in Leicester and so on. So there's some stuff around student social mixing, because there are still some students around, and there are plenty of students who've moved into their accommodation as of July the 1st. Yeah. And then the other one, as I say, is keeping an eye on your local university's kind of reopening announcements. And whether those announcements work and are credible and so on. Universities are working really hard right now to do all they can to reopen in time for September, but it's really tough. And some students are going to be, I suspect, quite disappointed by where that process comes out in terms of what's possible by September, potentially against what's been promised in terms of this kind of blended learning experience. So there's lots of aspects of that, how students are going to cope with it, how they'll behave, how much contact hours students will get, what their social distancing rules will be on campus, who will enforce them, loads of that sort of stuff where, student media could be making a really, really big difference, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice on where to start. Anonymous attendee has sent, we've had a question and something that I would call a comment in the Q&A. The comment is, "We miss you, Jim, come back to UEA."
Very funny, yeah.
Lovely. So we can't really answer that one apart from being, that's lovely. But we've had a couple of other questions come in. So the first one is, where would be best able to see the impact of strikes in the NSS when it comes out?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is actually really controversial. So, a few weeks back, there was a really big annual survey called the Student Academic Experience Survey that's published by the Higher Education Policy Institute and Advance HE. Sadly, it's a data set that includes thousands of students but doesn't drill down at institutional level. So, it's hard to get a university story out of it. But the reason I mention it is the data collection for that exercise ran about 4 weeks before the lockdown and about 4 weeks after the lockdown. And the scores on some aspects like teaching quality satisfaction were different for the people they interviewed after the lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And HEPI then put a press release out saying, well, this shows it, doesn't it? This shows it. This just goes to show that students have responded in a different way to lockdown teaching. Now, when we drilled into it, we realised that the profile of the students that submitted the survey before and after lockdown was completely different, and all the questions asked people to reflect on their entire university experience, not the 3 days that they'd been sent home for. So it was a kind of made-up story, and the reason I mention that is I think it's going to be really hard to identify the impact of strikes on NSS data in any meaningful way because of the way in which students are invited to answer. However, there may be some speculation around it that comes out in the press at the time. The trouble is it's likely to be clouded by more speculation about whether or not lockdown has had a specific impact on students' feedback or not. And it ends up as quite a noisy story. So it's really difficult actually to find stats that would prove one way or the other whether students are furious in terms of strikes. The strikes thing is really more about the number of students that sign petitions, the number of students that complain, and so on and so on.
Okay. Thanks everyone for putting some questions in. There's some good ones coming through now. I'm going to pick up on one. There's a couple of bits about like nightclubs bit, which isn't necessarily what we've been talking about. So we'll pick on those ones afterwards if we get time. Owine's asked for this, and Owine, by the way, has been in so many of these sessions this week. Well done you. I think you're from student fundraising actually. For the sources that you've provided in the talk that you've just given, do you need permission to use any of them, and can you see any conflicts or issues with criticising student unions and universities? And then how would you best deal with these pressures from unions? So there's about 3 questions in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's good questions. I mean, the answer to the first one is no, not at all. They're all open data, and that's why I say they're kind of hiding in plain sight. It's really annoying that they're kind of there and they don't get used. So they're quite interesting. Criticising universities and students' unions. Look, what I said at the start was, of course, that student communities are open and democratic student communities, and if you have good robust student media, one of the things I've always said to student unions is you should probably expect to be put under pressure from time to time by your student media. But what we see less of, I think, in our work is student media working up and getting extra information about stories from their student union, where in truth the student union would be quite pleased if you made something public that it didn't want to raise in public or whatever. So there are partnerships, I think, that you can strike that are fairly sophisticated, of the sort that you would find actually with national newspapers and journalists and people in the lobby and different politicians and so on. It's well worth trying to strike a sophisticated partnership about that, particularly over stories that might involve the university. I think the other thing I'd say is, we read a lot of what I would call really kind of unfair, fairly stupid stories about universities where local student media outlets have missed the point, not got the right data, and then end up winding people in the university up for the sake of it. If you've got good data and your reporting is good, most universities get that, from time to time, if they want a, decent student media where people learn from it and people go on to get jobs and win awards and so on, that they're going to be put under pressure over the facts. So, being, all the things that you would, that's already all of you thought about in terms of journalistic ethics and so on and so on. But, keeping the relationship up, I think, and making sure that, the relationship is an assertive partnership with the Students' Union, and that, you're talking to them and understanding where they come from and so on and so on.
Yeah. When I worked at NUS, we worked with the National Union of Journalists and the student media groups that we've partnered with for this event, and made the student media guide, and I'll put a link in the chat in a minute for that, because that's all about positive, constructive partnership between union and student media, and they shouldn't be concerned with that as long as Jim says, you're following like ethics of good journalism, and there's some advice from the National Union of Journalists about how to do that well. But you're perfectly within your rights to criticise them if there's a story there and you do that appropriately. Okay, another interesting question from, where is it? There's so many coming now. Do students always care about scandal stories on campus, or are they interested in info and positive stories? What is best? Tricky one there, because I'm sure it depends. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends what you mean by scandal story. Now, clearly, people are interested in that sort of stuff. There are media outlets that are really interested in that sort of stuff. That's what you want to do with your career. I don't want. I'm not one. I can't stop you. But what I'd say is the stories that are more about policy and the politics of the institution, the big decisions about where it's going, its performance, where it spends its money, whether it's serving students appropriately, whether it's delivering on the promises it's made, and so on, they are the ones that often get missed by student journalists. And ironically, if all you've got under your belt are sort of puff piece rewrites of press releases and some scandal stuff, then that might, get you a job at the Star or something. But, if you want to go and work in the specialist press, or you want to end up, working for the broadsheets and so on, you've got less to show for your portfolio. So, having a breadth, I think, is really important. And, what I'd say is a really well-researched story that comes off the back of, some of the data sources, for example, that I've talked about, but then also mixes in some of the human aspects, is a really killer story. I said to someone a couple of weeks ago, we read a lot of statistical reports every morning at Wonkhe. And about 8 months ago, well before COVID hit, I was on the train one morning and we were reading a piece of work, a statistical survey from the National Deaf Children's Society. And what they'd done is they'd asked all of the students that they knew that they'd supported that were now in higher education about whether or not, having entered higher education, they were able to actually access their teaching, whether the access measures had been put in place so that those students could access their teaching. A scarily high number of students were just unable to access higher education altogether because, the adjustments hadn't been put in place. But what was brilliant was the National Deaf Children's Society had, so that journalists wrote it up, provided 3 or 4 human interest case studies of real students who could then talk about their experience in relation to that. And talking to The Guardian, that story got really, really good numbers for The Guardian. So, as I say, where you find the human aspects in some of these big policy stories, you move beyond that kind of, tittle-tattle, kind of scandally, gossipy story that will get you plenty of clicks, but, in the end is kind of electronic chip paper, and gets you into, holding to account the people in power who we all pay a lot of money to run universities. And that's, that's exciting stuff. And that's where the big jobs come.
Thank you. Right, we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. I'm going to go with the one that's just come up because I think you'll be interested in this, Jim, about it's quite a long question about the SU kicking things into the long grass. So whenever students have tried to set up, the SU say that they can't risk student journalists harming relationship with stakeholders, so it's best to talk students out of it. How can students get around this?
I mean, 2 things. I think that's sad, really. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. For lots of student unions, you've got to see this from their point of view. For lots of student unions, it's a real battle for survival sometimes. You know, the student unions are funded by the university. You know, that often, you know, grants to student unions are under threat, and, you know, a lot of that is coming up in the next few weeks, you know, partly because of the, you know, financial crisis because of COVID and so on. However, two things. One, clearly, the opportunity to be involved in student media and to participate in this kind of wider soup of kind of on-campus, you know, democratic culture, surely has got to be right sitting in the middle of the mission of most student unions and universities. So it might be making sure that you talk to the right people in the student union and you talk about your kind of wider vision and so on. But look, I mean, the other thing I'd say is, you know, there aren't nearly the same sorts of barriers to setting these things up as there used to be. You know, and anyone can be a publisher, blah, 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 blah. You know, people are able to set these things up fairly quickly electronically. So, you know, I think, you know, ideally you would want to be in a position where your work is supported and championed and, you know, someone's paying for your, you know, media law training and, you know, helping you, you know, find the right stories and so on. But at the very least, you know, quite often people are able to kind of just crack on and get these things sorted anyway without the sorts of permissions that, you know, sometimes people say they need.
Yeah, and I'd share with them, I've dropped a link to the student media guide in the chat, so for that person, whoever it is that's having a problem, have a read of that. It's been designed for SUs and student journalists to read in tandem and then have a relationship together. So if they haven't read that, not passively aggressively, but send it to them and encourage them to read it. But also, I'm going to drop a link in now for, I've freed up a little bit of my time next week for consultant chats to problem solve stuff. And I work with SUs weekly. So if you want to book a chat with me to work out like a bit of a strategy for chatting to your SU about it, I'm happy to do that. Jim, let's pick up this nightclub question. I know it's a little bit irrelevant to what you've been talking about, but it's come through in two different ways. So one of the questions has been, what do you think is the best way for an SU that doesn't have a club or a bar to get strong engagement with students? Do you think it's through supporting a student media unit? And then there's another random bit about, do you think SUs will be able to survive without income from their nightclubs next year? So just pick up your thoughts on that and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, quickly on the latter question, every student union has a different mix of income from commercial sources. Principally, that involves students buying things, either VKs or, you know, sandwiches or whatever it might be, and grant funding from their university. And depending on the extent to which they're leveraged commercially, and depending on the position their university finds itself in terms of international student recruitment in the run-up to September, home student recruitment and deferral in the run-up to September, some student unions are going to find it really, really tough. I don't think the principal kind of determinant in how tough a student union will find it is whether or not it has a nightclub. It's much more likely to be this slightly wider question about the mix of income and so on. All student unions in the UK are charities. You can look at their accounts on the Charity Commission's website. You know, again, that's all open data. Worth talking to the student union about the pressures it is under, if it is under pressures in the run up to September. Certainly a lot are. And then this other one about getting engagement. I think what I'd say about that is, obviously, lots of institutions and student unions have tended, you know, to find it much easier to get engagement from kind of full-time residential students that are, you know, 18 to 21, what some people sometimes call traditional students, and so on. And you know, a nightclub might make that very difficult in September if that's your principal way of doing that, because probably won't be having nightclubs in September, at least not in the same way. What I would say is that one of the things I think we've learned from the pandemic is you get a hell of a lot of student engagement over things they really care about in terms of their student experience. So one of the things that we found out quite early on in the pandemic is the hundreds of thousands of students around the country that signed a petition in support of a no detriment policy at their university, for example. Now, one of the ways in which students can be activated around aspects of their student experience, to think about them, talk about them, have them reported on, compare them, understand how the university works and makes decisions, is through student media. Students' unions are often very busy, lobbying behind the scenes to make things better for students. They probably haven't got time a lot of the time to be doing that kind of reporting on and communicating with students. And so that's, if you've got decent student media on campus, that's a really good way to get students caring about lots of these issues in terms of university decision making and so on. And certainly, if it's right, and I think it's right, that we're heading into a term which will be very, very different in terms of social distancing, the volume of on-campus activity and so on, electronic publications that are reporting on things, making sense of things, and giving students a sense of connection to their wider institution are going to be more important rather than less important come September.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for that. I think it's going to be really helpful for people in the future, and hopefully we'll see some interesting stories coming out of the people who are in this session today. If anyone wants to carry on talking about this stuff, I'm going to drop a link in a second for the coffee shop, which is our virtual place for you to have casual conversations about the topics. Jim may head over there if he's got a few minutes, but I'm sure he's got lots to be getting on with today too. Jim shared his social media details at the start of the session, so a good place to follow Jim, follow Wonkhe, and you can keep an eye on some of these stories as they develop. But yeah, thanks very much. And I think we're going over now. So in the next hour at the festival, in 10 minutes, we've got our third keynote, which is interesting. So we've got Ariel Free, who is a Radio 1 presenter. But we've also got a session from somebody from the Open University about engaging students with community volunteering remotely. So 2 really interesting sessions. Encourage you to join in with those. Thanks so much, Jim, for joining us on this lovely Friday afternoon to talk us through these 10 HE stories that you might be missing. And thanks to all of you for participating. See you all soon.